I told John 11. Maybe we'll get 11. 6, I'd be happy with. But I'm thrilled to see you all here. Today, I'm the main speaker. And I'm going to give you a presentation that I have been developing for many years, that I've used quite a bit, but I keep updating it. And it's one that I actually enjoy doing. And it's going to give us, as I like to say, a review of history, where we'll talk a lot about the 60s, and we're going to talk about demand side and supply side and all that, but we're going to couch it in a lot of history. And as I like to say, we have bookends here. At one end, we're going to start with Al Capone, and at the other end, we're going to end with George W. Bush. So those are the kind of ends of this conversation, the 1920s through 2000. This is kind of a general introduction, which is going to, I hope, help you understand a lot of the things that are coming up over the next weeks of the course as we start looking at fiscal and monetary policy, as we look at trade policy, as we look at the role of labor, we look at the role of education, we look at the role of immigration. All of that this kind of sets the stage for all of that. So relax, sit back. You don't have to take a lot of notes because this is already on our website, policyschool.neu.edu, because we thought there was a very good possibility we wouldn't be here tonight, none of us, and therefore we wanted you to at least have the notes for you. So let's get started. I need to open. How about right there? Boy. So what I'm going to try and do is take a look, and I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so. Professor Minehan is going to respond to this, and then we're going to have a lot of time to, I hope, open this up for conversation. So as I said, we're going to start with the Roaring Twenties. And if you think about the Roaring Twenties, we had 3 Republican presidents. Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, Warren Harding, who was only in office for a little bit, and then Herbert Hoover, who is in office during the stock market crash in October of 1929. This was a time in which America was being celebrated as the new boom economy. Before World War I, if you were to really ask the person on the street anywhere in the world what country dominates the planet, probably 7 or 8 out of 10 would say Great Britain. Here we have England with the Royal Navy dominating the seas, this very strong industrial economy, and colonies spread out so much across the world that it really was true that the sun never set on the British Empire. The sun was always shining if it wasn't cloudy outside on Canada or Australia or South Africa or British Guiana or Hong Kong. That was Britain. Coming out of World War I, the United States begins to be seen as the dominant power. And many people will talk about the 20th century as the American century. We come out strong, having entered the war late and having played with the American expeditionary forces in Europe a major role in bringing World War I to an end. We build up tremendous industrial capacity. It's also a time that we celebrate. Flappers, speakeasies, somehow we pass a constitutional amendment outlawing alcohol. We learn very quickly that isn't very smart and we repeal it. Of course, the person who may have been most notorious of the time was Al Capone in Chicago. And I always like to think, because I'm a kid of the 1960s and 70s, his arch enemy was Eliot Ness, of course, of what group in the FBI? The Untouchables. And here's the really good question. Does anybody remember who plays Eliot Ness in The Untouchables on television?
The new one or the old one?
Robert Stack. Exactly. So you know most of what you need to know about the 1920s. It was an era of great generals. Huge corporations are being brought together. General Motors is actually being brought together by people like Alfred Sloan, bringing together individual automobile companies, of which there had been actually thousands. Hundreds of some substance, dozens quite powerful. General Motors brings together the Chevrolet division, the Chevrolet company, the Pontiac company of Pontiac, Michigan, the Oldsmobile Company of Lansing, Michigan, the Buick Automobile Company of Flint, Michigan, and the Cadillac Company of Detroit, Michigan, forming the second largest automobile company in the world, second to Henry Ford's privately owned, family-owned company, does not become a corporation until 1951. And Henry Ford himself is bringing together the Ford Motor Company of himself. He buys a company called Mercury, he buys a company called Lincoln Continental, and he forms a major company there. Meanwhile, the Dodge brothers in Detroit are buying up a company called Plymouth. They're buying up a company called DeSoto. They're buying up a company called Chrysler, and one that manufactures a car called the Imperial. Most of you in the room will never know those automobiles, but as a kid growing up in Detroit, as I was, these were really icons of Detroit. They're huge tailspins of the 1950s and 60s. General Electric is becoming one of the largest electrical goods companies, again, by assembling all kinds of diverse firms under it. Westinghouse, Bethlehem Steel, United States Steel. It is a time of mammoth growth of corporate strength. We also get stock market boom. We see that in this period following World War I, that people who invest in the stock market are starting to see that investments in firms like American Telephone and Telegraph, Western Electric, General Motors, Chrysler, are places where they can do very well. In fact, the banks are more than, they're thrilled to be able to loan people money with very little down payment at reasonably low interest rates if you'll invest some money in the stock market. And the dream was that you could take $100 and borrow $1,000, put $1,000 in the stock market, and 6 months later you've doubled your money. And some people actually did that. Some people built up fortunes. Not a lot of people. Very few Americans were invested in the stock market, and there was no such thing as a 401k, so very few workers had anything like this at all. If you were a worker and you had a little savings, you put it in the local bank, in a passbook savings account where the person behind the counter, the teller, would write in how much you had, and they would multiply by 0.03 every once in a while because you got 3% interest on your money. But we had a boom and it continued to rise, and in fact, when I first began talking about these issues back in the early 1980s, I had to explain this very carefully to audiences because they'd never experienced a boom like that, nor what happened after a major stock market crash. But of course in 1987, not of course, for some of you, of course in 1987, we saw a stock market crash of which the stock market on Dow Jones lost a quarter of its value on a single day, also in October. Drop of 508 points on a stock market of about 2,000. And of course more recently, we've seen irrational expectations in the stock market, leading to great booms, great declines. NASDAQ going through the roof, Dow Jones going up to 14,000. I think it was trading at about 8,300 today after a pretty good day on the market. But you had this stock market boom. And you had, behind all of this, most importantly, a celebration of a new way to run an economy called laissez-faire. Let it be. Government should play a very small role, if any, in the economy. Taxes should be low, there shouldn't be much regulation. If you allow the private sector free rein, things will work out, for the most part, for the best of all possible worlds. That is the philosophy of Mr. Coolidge, that is the philosophy of Mr. Harding, that is the philosophy of Mr. Hoover. And then, of course, at the very end of that period, in October 1929, it all comes tumbling down. Now, the reason why it comes tumbling down is if you think about it, and those who were smart enough more recently probably took some of their money out of the market, is that prices on the stock market will go up as a result of speculation and expectations. But ultimately, every share of stock is issued by a corporation. And if you think about it, in the long run, the value of that stock can't be much greater than the value of the corporation. And so you had corporations that might have been growing in value at 5 or 6 or 7 or even 8% a year, but their stock was going up at 20 or 30 or 40% a year. At some point, that just cannot be sustained. And in the summer of 1929, before the stock market crash, some people started getting out of the market. Some of the big investors who kind of understood this to protect themselves. But then the stock market kind of stabilized for a little bit. People put money back in the market. And then in October, it all fell apart. And it fell apart with great speed, and the only time that we've really seen something like that happen again was 1987. And of course, we just saw it recently, this past fall. Hoover was proud of saying, or was known for saying, as this is all occurring, don't worry, prosperity is just around the corner. And how do I know that? Because my economic advisors tell me so. And what were his economic advisors telling him? They're telling him kind of a very basic economic story, which often, in normal times, is accurate. But in extraordinary times, like post-October 1929, breaks down. And what did the story go like? It went something like this. Yes, we've seen a stock market crash. Yes, things are very bad. But thank God we have flexible prices. Because one of the things we immediately see is prices plummeted, as we're seeing that happening on housing, as we're seeing it on flat-screen TVs, as we're seeing it at auto dealers today. I actually just bought a new car, a 2009 automobile, the only one in Boston to do this in the last 2 months. And I actually paid for a much better car, a lower price than I paid for my 1997 Ford Taurus. Stunning, and it's a much better car. That's kind of amazing that those prices would be about the same 10 years later on a car that has 3 times more safety, bigger engine, everything, a more efficient engine and everything else. But you see prices so steep. You can just pick up any newspaper and see what's going on at Lord & Taylor at one end, or at Home Depot, or Target at the other. The idea, however, that laissez-faire economists were saying is, because prices are falling, we're having a sale on pretty much everything. And when you have a sale on stuff, people will begin to buy. And therefore, the expectation is, in 1929, 1930, if the government just keeps their hands out of the pot, falling prices will get people back into the market. They'll begin to buy. Inventories of all those products that are stacked up in the backyard or in the back warehouse will be drawn down. Companies will need to restock those inventories. They'll start to rehire workers. Now workers will have more money in the pocket. They'll go out and buy, and you can see how this thing could reverse. The problem, of course, was prices could fall quite a bit, but there was so much poverty, so much unemployment, so much fear that nobody bought. As a matter of fact, you would have thought at that time, economists would have said to Mr. Hoover, this is not working, let's try something else. But as a matter of fact, most of them said, actually there's a second price that we can rely on. And it's called wages. Wages and salaries. Those are the prices of workers. And in fact, following the 1929 crash, workers went on sale. You could actually get workers at a much lower wage rate, about 30% off in some industries. And the thought was, wow, businesses will go out and hire all these workers because workers are on sale. Of course, if you have tons of inventory in the back lot, even if workers were going for nothing, you're probably not going to hire them, so that didn't happen. And these economists had a third price that they talked about, the interest rate. They said the interest rate is also a price. It's the price of loanable funds. It's the price that you can use to borrow funds. And the interest rate was plummeting. Nobody was borrowing. And with very low interest rates, the thought was, well, companies will go out and invest in new equipment, they'll build new factories, we'll put people back to work, and we're back to the races. But of course, you have to realize there'd been a tremendous investment in new plant and equipment during the 1920s. Much of it not fully depreciated, much of it still quite useful, and in any case, we had too much plant and equipment for the amount we needed to produce. So none of the fundamental declines in prices, price of goods and services, the price of workers or wages, or the price of money, could fall fast enough to turn this around. The way we think about it, and you've seen this equation I think once before in class, but we'll see it a lot more, is what is kind of the basic modern Keynesian equation. Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That I want you to remember. Some years ago, a student of mine brought me a CD by a comedian that some of you may remember from Saturday Night Live years ago, named Father Guido Sarducci. Father Guido Sarducci was the gossip columnist for the Vatican on Saturday Night Live. But he was also very popular on the college circuit. And he made a CD, and on one of those CDs, there was a cut called The 5-Minute University, which as a faculty member of nearly 40 years, I listened to very carefully. And what Father Guido Sarducci said, and I wish I could do it in that wonderful kind of Italian Vatican accent, but I can't, is, you know, your parents pay all this money to send you to college, but how much do you really remember 6 months after you graduate? He says, what I'm going to do is create the $5 university. You pay $5, it's a 5-minute university, you pay $5, and we will teach you everything that you would remember 6 months after your parents had spent $160,000 on a 4-year education. Supply equals demand would be the economics course. You know, the business course would be something like, you know, buy cheap, sell dear. There'd be a Spanish course which would teach you how to say hello, right? Having a 17-year-old at home studying for final exams, I understand this. The 5-minute university in this course is Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. It summarizes so much, as you're going to see. What it says is Y stands for gross domestic product. It's the total output of an economy. C stands for consumption, generally what households do. I stands for investment, generally what business does. G stands for government spending. This is when government actually goes out and buys something, as opposed to transferring income between people through Social Security or unemployment benefits. X stands for exports. That's when foreigners buy something that we produce. And M stands for imports. That's when we buy something somebody else produces. And you'll notice there's a minus in front of the M, and the way to think about that is that when we buy an import, let's say one of us were rich enough to buy a $55,000 Lexus automobile, some $55,000 essentially gets transferred out of the country. We deplete Y by that much. So C, I, G, X all add to GDP, increases M, decreases M. Well, think about what's happening after 1929. What's actually happening on the day after 1929 is not much except a few people leaping out of the Empire State Building who had lost their fortunes because they'd invested in the equivalent of Mr. Madoff of the days. But that shouldn't have really affected the economy just because the stock market fell, particularly because very few people own stock. But what happened is there was a panic that got kind of started, a little bit like we have now, and people started worrying about whether they would be able to hold on to their jobs, and therefore they stopped buying. Moreover, remember all those workers who had put their money into bank accounts? Those banks had loaned money out to people who put it in the stock market. When the stock market crashed, those people couldn't pay their bank loans back. And since the banks weren't insured at the time, the banks had no money to give back to those people who had painstakingly saved their $500 over 9 years. And all of a sudden, all your savings are gone. Think about one of those guys as being on a Chevy assembly line in Flint, Michigan. Still's got his job. It's probably a he by back then, as a matter of fact. But all of a sudden, he went to his bank, and his bank doors were closed, and he couldn't get his savings out, and in fact, he'd lost his savings. Still has his job, but all of a sudden, he feels incredibly poor. This is not the time you're going to buy anything special. You're going to try and rebuild those savings. Well, with everybody trying to do that, consumption plummets. And as consumption plummets, that's when the layoffs start. And once the layoffs start in one industry, they just kind of catapult into other industries. Fewer Chevys got purchased, which meant that GM bought less steel. which meant the steel companies laid off workers, which also meant that the mines that mined the coal, the limestone, and the iron ore got laid off. As did the doctor who worked in the coal mine town, got laid off. And you can see how this would all come apart. So consumer bust, no jobs, no savings, no hope. Sorry.
How much also did this have to, like, if Europe, particularly Germany, had not been already in a deep recession, could the U.S. have exported its way out of the recession at that point?
As a matter of fact, the rest of the world, minus 2 countries, is going through the same thing. England is seeing this happen, France is seeing this happen. The only 2 companies who actually escaped the Great Depression are Germany and Japan.
And the Soviet Union.
What?
And the Soviet Union.
To some extent. But what happens in those countries is there's a massive buildup for World War II, as well as some big public finance jobs. I mean, Hitler is laying out interstates.
Right, but
But-
did our recession leading to the Great Depression come first, or because Germany had been in recession since like 1916?
That's right. But with the buildup of military arms in Germany, they escaped the worst ravages
Right.
of the 1930s.
They had it bad in the early 20s.
Right, which
Right after the First World War.
which probably brought Hitler to power.
Yeah.
Right, the
Right.
middle class got wiped out by both recession and hyperinflation.
Right.
Savings were blown apart by billion% inflation. But by the 1930s, both Japan and Germany actually escaped the ravages of huge unemployment because they've got everybody working in workplace. So we have an investment bust as these companies no longer are investing. At the time, the idea was everybody's got to balance their budgets. Families got to balance their budgets. Companies got to balance their budgets. So should the government, including the federal government. They could print money. We're printing it now. But the idea was the government had to balance its budget. And therefore, as revenues declined, the federal government cut its budgets. And of course, state and local budgets were being cut drastically because they do have to balance the budget. And that's why we're having so much trouble in Massachusetts today. So, C's going down, I's going down, G is going down. In addition, because the rest of the world is starting to feel this, our exports decline. And as a matter of fact, imports were such a tiny part of the equation at that time that they had very little impact. Here's the point. If C is going down, I is going down, G is going down, X is going down, and don't worry about M, what must happen to Y? Anybody? What?
Go down.
It's got to go down. Can you be a little more enthusiastic? If every piece of the equation is going down, Y is plummeting. And then the last question I usually raise is, who makes Y? Who makes Y?
And which part of it?
Who makes it? Who makes GDP?
Everyone?
We do. All of us. We produce GDP. We're workers. We're the ones responsible for making GDP. Workers, managers, executives, down to the person who sweeps the floor. So if Y is falling, unemployment is going to go through the roof. And that's exactly what happened. So that by 1933, March 4th, 1933 was the day we inaugurated Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the first time. Our best estimate of the national unemployment rate was 25%. To give you an idea how high that is, we project that if things really get out of control this time, we'll have an unemployment rate nationwide of somewhere between 8 and maybe as bad as 10. The highest unemployment rate we've seen in my lifetime was 1982 when it hit 10.8% in November of 1982. Yeah?
I recently heard Robert Reich quoted on the radio, or not quoted, but speaking,
Yeah,
saying that,
on Marketplace.
yeah, saying that only 40% of the people who are eligible for or who lose a job actually are able to collect unemployment benefits.
Correct.
And I'm wondering if that unemployment rate is counted
No.
by that, or when you say 8 to 10%, does that mean it's really like more like 20%? How?
Well, first of all, that's not how we count the unemployment rate, and in a future class we're going to talk about that. Unemployment rate, the way we calculate it, has nothing to do with whether you're collecting unemployment benefits or not, or whether you've made a claim. We collect it through a survey called the Current Population Survey. I think I pointed out in this class, maybe I didn't, because Cathy, Professor Minehan brought it up, that the unemployment rate currently at now 6.9% nationwide, if you add in discouraged workers, people who would like to work but can't find it and have given up looking, and you add in people who are what we call involuntarily part-time, who'd like a full-time job but the best they can get is 22 hours at Walmart, the current official underemployment rate is 13.5%. We're looking at a real possibility of that rate going close to 20% if this recession plays itself out the way it looks like it's playing itself out. 1 out of 5 people, either unemployed, discouraged, or underemployed. That is a staggering number.
And that was the same measure that they were counting.
Well,
FDR.
we've improved on that measure significantly,
Yeah.
but we probably had about 25% of the population fully unemployed. We might have had 40 to 45% who were underemployed. My grandfather was one of them. My grandfather was literally one of those people who sold apples on the corner in Brooklyn. And he had been an accountant for Schraff's Candy Company until 1929. So, Great Depression. We elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we'll do it 4 times. And that will be what we'll talk about as the New Deal. When Roosevelt is first elected, he is actually not a New Dealer. He actually is elected on a platform which talks about balancing the budget. But it's very clear very soon that this is not going to work. The times felt very much like the times feel now, a time for radical action. And so the question was, what could we do? And the very first thing they tried to do was actually to set prices, because prices had fallen so quickly that actually the prices that things were being sold at, if they could be sold at all, were below the cost of production. And therefore you couldn't get any companies to produce anymore. And so through the National Recovery Act, NRA, the federal government actually tried to force companies to set prices. That was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So Roosevelt and his advisors go back to work and they say, what can we do? And they come up with an incredible set of what today we call public investment fiscal stimulus programs. The biggest being the Works Progress Administration, which not only sent billions of dollars to states and local governments to build bridges and roads and sidewalks, but also began to employ all kinds of people in other things. If you go to the town of Lexington here and go into the main post office on Main Street in Lexington, you'll see a phenomenal mural of the shot heard round the world, the April 1775 beginning of the American Revolution, painted by some of America's great muralists. And it was paid for by the artist project of the WPA. I love to tell the story that I'm a great believer in the WPA because if it hadn't been for the WPA, I wouldn't be here. It turns out that my parents lived in New York during the Depression, before they were married. And my father, as the story goes, asked my mother out on their very first date. And he was taking her to a play put on by the WPA players, and I think it was a Clifford Odets play. And he picked up my mother on the first date, and he had enough money for the trolley, for the streetcar. But by the time they got to the theater, my father found out he did not have the 50 cents he needed for each of the tickets and had to borrow the money from my mother. And since my father could never repay her, he had to marry her. And as a result of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I'm here. So we had all kinds of programs like that, writers' projects. We had writers like Eugene O'Neill, John Desplasos, who were unemployed. We put them to work writing the history of every state in the nation. And a few years ago, a publisher started publishing again, the WPA Guide to Massachusetts, the WPA Guide to Cape Cod. Fascinating reading. We had the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which set prices on agricultural goods, not directly, but had the government buy up surplus food in order to try and increase demand to raise the price above the cost of production. Then as now, the largest number of people who are unemployed, or at least the largest proportion, were teenagers, mostly teenage men, mainly teenage men living in cities. We created the Civilian Conservation Corps to help blaze trails and cut fire roads in rural areas, and move kids out to rural areas and put them up in big barracks and paid them a little money which they sent back home. Today, and I used to do a lot of hiking in when I was a little younger.